So FIRE is a standard for healthcare data exchange, for which I'm the project lead and chief toolsmith and so forth. One of the tools, most of the tools I maintain are in Java, and they're runtime execution engines that do various things to support people who want to implement FIRE. But I have two other tools. Then one of them is a server, a RESTful server. It's entirely written from scratch in Pascal Delphi. And it's here in the server folder. And so it runs as a server in the background and puts up a web server running on Indie server that and OpenSSL that runs a proper RESTful server. And that's been out running on the internet for I think 8 years now, and it's had hundreds of 380 something releases over the 8 years as I gradually fix bugs and add features and so forth. And then everybody else compares their server against my server to make sure that they've got the implementation correct. And then the other tool that I write in Pascal is a general purpose IDE.
Mach's mal warm, ja? Oder soll ich noch ein bisschen? Ich mach's mal zumindest in den Pott, ja, mit warmem Wasser.
I think somebody needs to mute their John. And then the other thing that I write is a toolkit. So the toolkit allows people to work with content and do various development-oriented stuff. So for a long time, I wrote this in Delphi. And then when Delphi released their FireMonkey, that solved a big problem for me because I needed to release the toolkit on OS X. Too many of my users couldn't manage virtualization. I mean, programmers can, but it's kind of not a happy place to be. But non-programmers, it's not going to happen. So I tried FireMonkey, but just never got happy with FireMonkey. Developing on one platform and using a remote debugger to another, painful. Had FireMonkey bugs, FireMonkey limitations. It just is never a good fit for me. So about a year ago, when lockdown started, I said to myself, and it was a project I've been working on in the background. I said, I'm going to finish this project and get all my code compiling in FreePascal and then move my visual stuff over to Lazarus because it can run cross-platform. So I'll go back to here. Here I have all my library code. And I'll go through the way it's organized shortly because organized for Lazarus packages. Have all my Fire code, all my library code, my database code, all that stuff. It all compiles either in Delphi or in FreePascal. And then my new visual tools, I said I won't use Delphi anymore. I use Lazarus. And so they only compile in Lazarus because they use LCL, which is the Lazarus equivalent of the VCL. And it's pretty similar. And so all of the working executable code cross compiles. And for me, cross compiles means it compiles under Delphi for Windows 64. It compiles under Lazarus, Windows 32, Windows 64, Linux 64, OS X on Intel, and OS X on M1. Both of those 64-bit. I don't actually publish any 32-bit code anymore. It's all 64-bit. All my code, I have several thousand unit tests which run on a unit test wrapper that I wrote that on Delphi sits on top of DUnit and on FreePascal sits on top of FPC unit. All the tests pass under Windows. About 99% of the tests pass under Linux. I've got a couple of loose edge cases to chase down. And about 80% of the tests pass on OS X. That's a work in progress. around just a bunch of things I haven't figured out what the problems are yet. So it's kind of an overview of what I'm doing. Does anyone have any questions about that overview? No. Okay. So this is Lazarus. I'm not going to talk about installing Lazarus today, except to say it's not fun. Richard gave us a demonstration of using FreeCUP Deluxe to up and install Lazarus, and I use that on all platforms. I'm working on the current dev branch of Lazarus because I need the current dev branch of FPC for its support of generics. I can't use older versions of Lazarus because of that. But other than that, I don't really particularly care about versions of Lazarus or whatever. Just I need the latest dev branch for some code compiler issues. So then after I've installed it, the first thing I do is I install the Anchor docking package, because I don't want Windows scattered all over my desktop. I hate that. And so installing these two packages, and then what happens is I get a single screen, and I can, for instance, let's say I want to skip to debug mode. Oops, here's the debug mode. Call stack and watches, and I want to add a debug window. Let's say I want to see local variables. It pops up on the screen, and I can dock it here. And so pretty much that bit's like Delphi, in that I could do the same in Delphi. Debug windows, local variables, and drag that around, right? It's pretty much the same. I wouldn't consider using Lazarus without those two packages installed that bring it back to work like Delphi. The key difference for Delphi, between Delphi and Lazarus is that IDE. Say I bring up my form actually comes up in a window that I can't dock, right? The form editor is not dockable, and so you get the Lazarus window along with all of the forms as separate forms. I have mixed feelings about that. When I go back to working in Delphi visually occasionally, because I still do a little bit of visual work in Delphi, although mostly now it's just code. But when I go back, I'm kind of like, in some ways it's better to be able to, to have the form come up in the dock. And otherwise, it's actually much better to have it on a separate screen. You're multi-screen. You really need multi-screen for this. And to be able to, flip between them with your mouse or your tab or whatever. But so it's like pros and cons, right? But that's how it works. And so there's my main form for my toolkit program. But otherwise, everything else is docked. Now, there's a problem with the dev build of Lazarus, which I haven't reproduced in other builds, but occasionally it just totally loses its layout. You just open it up and the layout's gone. And the windows are in impossible places, and it can be really hard to chase them down. So one of the things that I do is keep saving the current desktop, and then I can actually export the desktops and then import the desktops again and bring it back. So every time I play with setup, which I don't do very often because I've got a setup or how I like for the different views, and I export everything out so I can just recover it. So it does have multiple views, and I can flip between the views, and you can also, and you have to configure this, you can put in this button here to flip between the views on the toolbar, which as far as I know, you can't do in Delphi because you've got it up here. But all you can do in Delphi, whoops, it disappeared, is change between the views from that button. So I kind of prefer Lazarus on this if it was reliable, because I'm in the dev branch. All right, any questions about that? No, everybody's listening carefully. Okay. All right, so the basic idea with Lazarus is a new form. Is pretty much the same as Delphi. It's no different. Oops, I got that wrong. Here's my button. I've missed my finger when I put it on. Here's my button. Okay. All right, I can do all the same things. Let's change the mode though. Back to dev. And back to the form, and I've got a form layout designer with the object inspector here. We'll change the caption. F12 to bring the form back. So you see that when you're jumping between the form and the object inspector, the form disappears when you go to the object inspector. That's not so fun. That's why you really need a second screen for that. Just, you know, and then you put, like in this case, I'm going to put it's off the screen for what I'm sharing in Zoom, but the object inspector and the form are next to each other, and away I go. That's kind of cool, in fact, and I can still see the code at the same time as I can see the object inspector and the form. So that's good, which you can't have in Delphi, right? So again, it's pros and cons. You got different layout controls, and they're probably in terms of, you know, components, you've got all the standard components that you expect to see in Delphi, and they have pretty much the same. They have different class names, but they have pretty much the same functions and properties and procedures, particularly in the common, well understood, well used ones, and you just use them as if they're the same. But then, you know, what happens is you look up on Stack Overflow or something, and find some trick to customize it using the Windows API that underlies the control. And no doubt most of you have programs where you do stuff like that. And of course, you can't do that stuff if you're going to run on Linux or OS X, right? Or on a mobile phone, because you don't have Windows to do that. And so some of the things that are routine, you know exactly how to do it on Windows, they turn into a bit of a nightmare because you're just not quite doing the normal thing, and you've got to figure out how to pull it off and all the different platforms you target. But then you have data controls, or I don't use data controls, so I don't know how that works.
Just with that issue you were just saying, I haven't used FireMonkey much, but FireMonkey, you sort of don't really access the underlying controls as much, do you?
Well, but it's the same deal on FireMonkey. You get a FireMonkey control and you want to do something with it that's not quite, you know, in the API. And so you've got to fall back to, you either say, well, I can't do it then, or I got to fall back to the underlying system API, and you've got to do cross-platform code.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's choose your poison on that one. I obviously try not to do that, but sometimes you've got no choice. You just need, you know, to hook a particular user action to do something in the user interface, and you ain't got nothing in the standard API, and you're going to have to hook Windows Message or something in Delphi. It's harder if you're doing cross-platform. It's just the same. I mean, it's, if you're only doing Windows and you're using Lazarus, it's exactly the same, because you get the same handles, you have the same API. So it's not a Lazarus issue, it's a cross-platform issue. That makes sense?
Thanks, Grahame.
All right. So here's my form. Where was I? I've got a bunch of interesting new system components that you don't have around help and well, I haven't looked at this in Delphi for a long time, but there's some pretty cool Delphi stuff. So system stuff, a bunch of Lazarus specific controls. Here's the equivalent of C virtual string tree. It's a fork of the code. So if you like virtual string tree, you got that. Then you've got Synedit, which is what Lazarus itself is built on. So it's really, their branch is solid as a rock because, you know, it just works for Lazarus. And then a couple of other things that I've installed. You've got a charting thing, which I've never looked at. I don't know. And HTML viewer, which is Dave Baldwin's old HTML viewer code. HTML viewing is another cross-platform challenge. You would think that there would be a simple, just drop a web browser onto the form and it'll just work on all platforms. But I haven't found anything like that in the Lazarus space. I mean, there isn't one in the Delphi space. There's a FMX control, doesn't work on everything. And then you've got a, so in Lazarus, if you want to deploy a web browser that works across platform, this is the, for me, this is the best way because the frame viewer, this is, the HTML viewer is native code. And so I don't have to deploy anything like no Chromium or SpiderMonkey or whatever it is. I just shift my code, but it means that I can't use a bunch of HTML features, which are pretty old now, like, you know, JavaScript of any kind, because not supported by this. There's a commercial full stack HTML browser that's available for in Pascal that a guy sells, which looks pretty impressive, but I've never used it and I can't use it because everything I do is open source. And I talked to him about it, but no go. It's fair enough. So at the moment, I'm basically stuck in the dark ages on HTML. If anybody here knows a better approach, believe me, I'm all ears. Okay, any questions about control?
Yes, so you won't be able to use anything that has JavaScript in it, in that HTML component?
Yeah, not this one, because it's old and it just doesn't support JavaScript. I mean, you can sit down and write JavaScript for it.
And the whole world moved to JavaScript because of the React and all that sort of frameworks is all DOM manipulation. So you won't see anything of that in this browser.
Well, for me, I'm using it for HTML layout stuff that I wrote internally.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a workable compromise for me, but I certainly couldn't point it at anything that I didn't generate myself. You're right about that.
Just a quick one. Synops, I think, has got a library that you can use for that.
Is that those specific, isn't it? Synops?
I think it's for Lazarus and Delphi, I think, for JavaScript.
And it's,
I'm not 100% sure, so it might just be worth having a look.
well, I'll have another look.
Yeah,
Synops
website.
Yeah.
Actually.
Which one is it?
Synops.
How's it spelled?
SYNOPSE.
Yes. Synapse?
Synops, OPSE, I think it is. Let me just have a quick look on my browser.
Oh, it's a part of Mormont.
Yes, well, he's got an awful lot of libraries that aren't a part of Mormont. So
I'll have a look.
Delphi.
I looked at. I did look at stuff before, but it was something that wasn't that I needed anyway.
Yeah, it might be his, or he might have refactored somebody else's open source one. I can't remember, but I'll post it in the ADUG list when I find it.
He might have. Anyway, all these controls that are here in the standard Lazarus install work out of the box seamlessly, so far as I've found, on Windows and Linux and OS X. And that's pretty sweet. I mean, my code, there's a bunch of things where you find when the first time you run your code on a Linux, where you've made Windows assumptions or whatever, and you just have to, you know, work your way through that. And so now I have code that runs on all three platforms, and I don't have to recompile. What I have to do is, let's close this. I don't want this unit. No, before I talk about target platforms, I want to talk about packages. So packages in Lazarus are really, really different to packages in Delphi. So in Delphi, I tried mucking around with packages, and you have to muck around with packages if you're installing components. And I've had such an unhappy time with installing components that I just said, I'm never going to use code, never going to use packages for my code, right? For deploying stuff. I'd rather shift more bytes, particularly these days. So it's, 50 meg, 100 meg bigger, what to do? I'd rather shift more bytes and have stable and reliable. But Lazarus packages work really differently. So here's my project group for my project, and we're initially going to look at my simple project. No, we'll say with my toolkit project. My toolkit project has in the project, it has a bunch of files, source code. This is the actual source code, about 20 units that are the application. Almost all of the work is in the packages. So it uses a bunch of packages. So LCL is a base LCL. So the frame viewer and highlighters, these are Pascal time zone. These are external third-party open source packages. And then a couple of my own packages that it depends on. And then those packages, I can open up those packages, and here is this package. And then this package has got a bunch of units in it, Pascal units, and it's got own and additional package dependencies that refer to more files and more packages. So the way the compile works is when you compile the project, the compiler finds a package dependency and goes off and compiles a package, and the IDE just magically knows where the package is after you've opened it for the first time. So basically you get all the packages, you open them once and compile them, and then you forget about them. And the compiler goes off and compiles all the packages. And then at the end, it does one link that links all of the compiled code from all the packages you covered into a single executable. So packages are a compile time artifact rather than a runtime artifact. So only have a single linked executable unless you write a DLL specifically, or which is a shared object on Linux, and a dinlib on OS X. But the real advantage of this is the compiler keeps track of the currency and the dependencies of the packages, and it compiles the packages in parallel when the packages don't have dependencies between each other. Right, so you actually have the compiler compiling a bunch of different code in parallel, and that's useful because the compiler is not as quick as the Delphi compiler. It's maybe 3 times slower fundamentally, but this improves to that, and so you get but putting your code into packages means that you do a lot less compiling, and it's quicker. It's a bit of a mind change, and it takes you a while to, when you start working with Lazarus, I actually redesign my package layout 3 times in order to optimize the different ways that I'm working with packages, because the compile time, dev time, artifacts, it takes you a little bit of mind to figure out how to use it best. But it's pretty simple to understand what packages do. So anybody got any questions about that? Okay. So it's really key that Lazarus is a package-based IDE when you're dealing with your source. And it's really good too, because you can have your packages in different, GitHub repositories, and the linkage between them on your local system is implied. I've always, this has always been a problem for me, is how to do dependencies between GitHub projects and not tie other people to my paths. So that's a great way of solving the problem.
It sounds to me much better than how it works in Windows.
In Delphi?
In Delphi, yeah, in Delphi in Windows.
Yeah, I think it would be really good if the Delphi compiler worked the same way. They could do that, but they couldn't call them packages. And it certainly was a head spin for me when they told me, the Lazarus forums told me, oh no, you need to use packages. That's what your problem is. And I'm like, I really don't want to use packages, right? And so it took me a little while to get my head around that being so different. And then it took me a little while to figure out what my right package structures were. And there are runtime and dev time packages. The runtime packages the design time packages are packages that depend on the Lazarus dev API and bind into Lazarus. So the Lazarus itself is an empty shell. All of these different parts that you can see on the screen are all Lazarus packages that you can see the source for and modify. For instance, where's a good example? I look at this and I think, gee, this is pretty crappy. I don't want to know that text all the time, right? Once I've seen it once, I don't want to know what it is anymore. It's just wasting my space. So I got around to chasing down the code where this was, figuring out how to add to the Lazarus options dialog itself an option to turn those on and off, and then submit that as a PR to Lazarus itself, and then forgot to do it, and have got around to doing it since I updated Lazarus recently. So it's pretty cool that you can see the entire source code. So I'll just give a very quick tour of the Lazarus source code. Here's Lazarus. Here's all the Lazarus source code. Because the way you would get it with FPCUP is that it assumes that you have the source. You have to have the source, and so actually, when you change your code, decide to install a package, what you do is you install a package. Say for some reason I wanted to install this package, which I don't. I have no idea what it does. I can add it to the installed list of packages, and I actually rebuild the IDE. Actually, the IDE compiles itself and then reruns itself. So it's not like a dynamic registration process. You actually recompile the IDE from scratch. And hey, I can just do that anyway, right? Tools, build Lazarus, bang. But you can, I don't have it installed here, but on my Mac, I think it is, I have two Lazaruses installed side by side. One's a debugging version of Lazarus, so it's compiled with all of the debugging flags set to true. And then I can open that Lazarus in my other Lazarus and debug Lazarus while I debug Lazarus and debugging my program, which, you just couldn't believe that you couldn't think of doing that with Delphi. But you've got all the source, and I've done that a few times. So when I was working up this down in the corner here, which is my equivalent of test insight for Delphi for Lazarus. All right. Yeah, questions about all that? Okay, let's go look at my project then. So my project, I have a few like standard setup options for my project, stuff that you'll be familiar with through Delphi, internationalization, some miscellaneous stuff about whether you've got a console app or not, manifests, stuff I haven't got around to yet. And then it gets interesting because you set up your build mode, hang on, set up your targets. I want to compile, this is the Windows application running on Windows. So I won't go into exactly what that means on other platforms. What am I looking at? Yeah, this fire toolkit. I'm not sure. Let's try this instead. This other project I was looking at this one before. So here you see what configurations I have for the compiler. There's the compiler, Win32, Win64, Linux, OS X, and some release codes. So let's look at OS X for interest. Target OS is Darwin, which is what they call OS X, which is not the same as Mac OS. You can still compile for Mac OS. That's pre-OS X days, but we're interested in Darwin. And I can compile for Intel or I can compile for M1. In fact, they already had the compiler for M1 in OS X before Apple released the M1. I'm like on the forums going, what are you guys going to do about M1? And they're like, nothing, because it's part of what we already do. So there's the M1 compile for OS X. And then I can just choose which platform I want to compile. In fact, there's a shortcut here. I can compile for Linux on Windows. In order to do that, I've got to install all the compile libraries. And there's a way to do that with FPC UP Deluxe. Of course, I can't run because I don't have Linux. So usually I just say, well, I'll just use, Windows 64 because that's what I'm on. And so I'll just compile them on Windows 64. But if I wanted, I can say, well, hey, I'm on the road. I have my Apple laptop. So I'm compiling and running into OS X, but I want to make sure that at least compiles under Windows so I can compile under Windows on my Apple laptop.
Is there a tool like the remote debugger, the PA server, that you could use in order to run from the development machine? Or is that not really an issue because you've got it on Linux anyhow, so you would compile it for Linux and Linux?
Yeah, I found it better. So what I haven't bothered exploring the question of remote PA server, because here's my Linux Lazarus running the same code, debugging the same code. I just connect to it. It sits on my desk and I VNC to it, or I can just, turn around. Here I am connecting to the PC directly. So,
okay.
Yeah, it hasn't really been something that I've looked at. All right. And then for my different compile options, I can specify for my build modes, which I've set up on this project. So the toolkit I was showing before, there were no build modes. I'm just like, I don't care. Just build for your local PC, and then I just work on my Linux box and my Windows box and my Mac M1, and just assume that all of the other stuff will work itself out. Whereas this project is the one where I do all the playing around with build modes and stuff. And then for each of the build modes, I can specify different compilation options, and this is where you're starting to get really interesting with Delphi. Basically, Embarcadero have to write all their own optimization code. But the back end of this is general linker that everybody uses. So you've got a lot more options here around the linker and the debugger, like how much stuff do you put into your executable, because you're piggybacking on the general dev chain rather than using a custom linker, which is what Delphi does. Of course, a lot of the speed difference is in that step, because the general purpose linker isn't quite so optimized for Pascal, so you pay for it with speed. But what it buys you is flexibility and power. So, John, you're going to ask a question?
Yeah, I just missed something. The build mode, is that similar to config in Delphi?
Yeah, pretty much. It's just you've got a lot more things to choose, including which platform you're compiling for.
So you can add your own configs, your own build modes.
Yeah, this is in here.
Yeah, so you can just call them whatever you like.
Yeah, that's right.
Sounds good.
And
Thanks.
and set them all up, and you don't have to. And then these are what you're picking from with this little button here is which build mode you want to build for. All right. So, and then you've got control over which messages you want to see, and then sometimes you might have to pass custom options through to the compiler because they're part of the FPC or the but they're not. They haven't done the UI for them. And then the other thing you get to specify, which you do once and you never think about again, is what widget library you want to be using underneath. I won't talk about the choice of widget libraries. I mean, in practice, you choose it once and then you move on. So you've got basically build modes and then a lot of choices for each of the build modes. Okay, any questions about that?
Are you going to talk about libraries? I had trouble finding libraries, and I might have just missed something. Yeah, like library paths.
Well, I don't really. Well, okay, yeah. So, so I don't. Okay, I'll talk about it.
It just seemed completely different from Delphi.
It is quite different because of packages. So these are the paths for the project, which are not the same as the paths for the packages it depends on. All right. So this is the standard path list for my project. So our part's the same as Delphi, but typically it's pretty empty because actually a lot of it's handled in the package dependencies, right? So you don't generally, you should be thinking in terms of, okay, what packages have I got? And the packages should be self-contained, and then you just add packages to your project, and really. So let's go back and look at my source. Here in my source for file server, I'm in this, and I've got some code in this folder and a code in the subfolder admin here. And so for my project options, I have admin as my sole path, right? But this project depends on a vast set of libraries, but each of those libraries has its own thing. So let's look at this, which is my most confusing, most complicated package.
Yeah, so if you're using like virtual tree view or something like that, you just have to include the package. You're not just specifying a path. Okay,
yeah, that's right.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, and then the IDE looks after the path for packages, and people can put it wherever the heck they want. But then each package has got its own. Whoops, that wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want to compile. I wanted to look at the options. Each package has got its own paths, which are relative to the package itself rather than the system or whatever. And so all these paths are internal dependencies that depend on code within the package, within the GitHub repo. Generally, I found that it's typical to have one package per repo, GitHub repo, although you can have more than one. But what you have to be really careful about is that these paths never overlap. Like see here, I've got my Indy 10 code. I run a hacked Indy 10 code because I'm working with Indy 10 pre-release version. So I'm a hacked Indy 10 release code for the latest version of OpenSSL. If I manage to have another package in the same project with a dependency path dependency that resolves to one of these directories, at some stage a long way down the track, it's going to go bang, and I won't be able to figure out why, because really mystifying evidence around that because of the way the compiler, the compile works. So it's just a rule when you're setting up your packages. And I wish somehow there was more documentation about this, or a tool, or maybe I should write one, that can go through all your packages and tell you if you have overlaps. Because if you do, man, you're going to pay for it. So these all, you just have to really make sure that the packages are all separated, because if your package can see a unit in another package directly, rather than by the package, sooner or later you're going to get a unit version mismatch. So it's just, discipline there. All right. So I'm going to show you a little bit about the IDE itself. So the IDE, the file and edit menus are not particularly surprising for a programmer. Search is pretty powerful, but not particularly surprising. The view menu, honestly, isn't that surprising. Where it starts getting surprising is when you get to project and package. So, because the layout here is quite different and resets a different concept of how you work with stuff. So first of all, I have multiple packages open at this time. Here's a package that's currently open. I can dock that if I want, although I generally find that just annoying, and so I don't dock them. There's a second screen for. Go back down there, and it's closed. So you tend to spend a lot of time in the package menu opening packages, although you can also open them here from here. That one came up off screen where I like them to come up usually. But you start by every time you grab a piece of code, opening the package directly and then compiling the package. And once it's compiling, then the server knows where, the IDE knows where it is, and you never think about that again. And so you can control click across packages, whatever. So that's the package menu. And then the other thing on the package menu is not just managing your own packages, but installing packages into the IDE itself, which I talked about briefly before. And then there's an online package manager, which is a kind of common registry of packages. And there's a heck of a lot of packages on there, although mine are not on there yet. I've got to get around to getting them on there. But since we're here, Mormont's here. Oh no, we'll worry about that later. Anyway, and then you can just install them directly from here, and that downloads it, sets it up on your local PC, recompiles Lazarus for you and restarts Lazarus. Bingo, away you are. So it's a package menu. Project menu, you can install an optional add-on through the packages, installing packages, and install the package group manager, which is, it's in here somewhere. Oh, I don't know, I can't see it now. Now I feel silly. Oh no, they've added it to the base here. You don't install it anymore. And that here, I can build myself a set of packages that are common packages, common projects I work with, either projects or packages. So when I'm working in this desktop space, I all jump around between all these different projects. Unlike Delphi, I can only have one project open. Right? I can't open and run more than one project, which is a pretty cool feature of Delphi, although if you're like me, you're constantly going, hang on, I'm on a line of code, but I don't remember which program I'm on the line of code in. And so I've found that to be variably useful. In Lazarus, if you want to do that, you just open more than one copy of Lazarus and just suck it up. But you can easily jump between your different projects here. and it's a pretty quick process. It's quicker than Delphi. So I've found project groups pretty comfortable as a way to navigate around my open project. And of course, the other big difference between Delphi and Lazarus is the project inspector, which you've actually already used, which is here. It shows you what files and packages your project depends on. And basically, you want to get as much out of the project inspector as you can, and as little out of the project options. So really, I was showing before, parse project options for parse only your immediate project. Don't do anything else with it. Do as much as you can with the project inspector. And anything that you share through a project. It's a much easier way to work. You can share stuff otherwise, but it's going to get you in a mess. Then you get the run menu. So first of all, the run menu, some of the things that are on the project menu in Delphi are on the run menu. So you can compile or build, or, and this is my favorite, just so much better than Delphi. I don't know how many of you have this process, workflow, but I fix a line of code and I hit F9 and I go, hang on, did you recompile that line of code? That's an obscure dependency. And then what I do is I do a build all, or a project build rather than a project compile. And then I discover that I've screwed up something else. So I fix the other line of code and then I F9, but actually it hasn't recompiled that other line of code because it didn't get to it in the build all, the build instead of the compile. And then I go, oh hell, I've got to go back and build everything. In Lazarus, it works differently. You say, I just want to, before I build, I want to delete all of the compiled stuff. And then you don't have to worry because it will be rebuilt. It has to be rebuilt. Because Delphi, it doesn't clean out. It only rebuilds. So if you have to always rebuild. And then you can't like say, well, I'm getting there, but I don't want to take the time. When you've got a small project, of course, it doesn't matter. When you got projects like I have with 2-3 million lines of code, it's starting to become pretty painful. I really, really like this feature of Lazarus, which is that you decide that you're going to delete all this stuff and you decide whether you're doing packages or just the project, which packages if you care, and then you just build. So I really like to clean up and build. And then the debugging part is pretty much, you've got all the options you'd expect to have. And I'll talk about debugging more in a second. So any questions about that? Okay, so as an IDE, once you get used to Lazarus, first when you're working with Lazarus, you're like, why is this? Why? It's Delphi is way better. But after a few weeks, and you've really started to actually figure out how to use Lazarus, you go back to Delphi and you feel trapped and restricted because you can't do the UI. The user interface is nicer, but the user experience doesn't have the underlying powerful ideas that Lazarus is built on. And so I find it restricting to go back to Delphi. Even though, particularly with large projects, there's still some things I'd like Lazarus to be able to do to give me more control. For instance, if I really want the linker to be quicker. Oh yeah, that's one thing. It links every time I run. That's a really annoying feature of Lazarus. And when linking takes a second, doesn't matter. But when linking takes 30, 40, 50 seconds, it's pretty painful. So one feature I really like in Lazarus is that it wouldn't relink if it hadn't recompiled when you debug. Any questions on that? Okay, all right. So here I am. I run my console mode. This is a little app that partners with a server because the server is running invisibly in the background and just shows the so there you go, it just ran, jumped off to my debugging screen, and somewhere it's coming up. So here it comes. Also, I don't have a server running at the moment, so there's nothing to see in the server console or in the status. But you know, I can configure out the server. There's nothing special about this particular program. It's just a nice, convenient demonstration. But let's do a bit of debugging. It's having trouble shutting down at the moment. I have not got to the bottom of that. It's something to do with the way it's trying to disconnect from a server it's not connected to. Pretty clever, huh? So here's my form list. The main console form. Where did the form go? It's not visible on my screen. No. There it is. I don't know where it was, but that's something you have to do occasionally. Chase down a window, just bring it back to the middle. So let's say that we're going to put a breakpoint on the form create. It's pretty straightforward. Here's the form create. Run. We've flipped over to debug mode. Here we are at the breakpoint. My call stack for where I am. It's really nice because I walk into the code directly. Rather than sometimes Delphi's a bit funny about that. I can have watches on here, although none of those watches are working. You know, this is nothing special compared to Delphi. If I really am, if I'm one of those kind of people, and I'm not, I can see the assembler. Here it is, walking through the assembler. I don't do assembly. I can see the registers and threads and yeah. So anyway, so debugging works. Any questions about debugging? No. How am I going for time, John?
Well, we normally finish about 8, but so you've got half an hour, and I think, well, I'm willing to stay longer if you're still talking after 8.
Probably. That's kind of where I'm heading towards. Maybe a little bit before then, with time for more commentary.
Yeah, there'll probably be a few more questions when you get to your finish.
I have a
Great.
question about debugging. In Delphi, you can sort of move the pointer in the
That's right.
and re-execute the same line over again. Can you do that in Lazarus?
No, I haven't found it. If you can, I've looked a couple of times. Let me have a look.
Just reset the program counter, I think.
Sorry?
I think you can reset the program counter. I was doing it years ago.
So
you've got to get the, what do you call the little what's name up, the thing that's got the registers in it.
Well, what am I doing here? Okay, well here's the other program that I work on. That's a bit weird. That's not supposed to appear. I was going to show you that. That menu is not supposed to be visible. Oh no, hang on, we're in the IDE mode. We're not in. Oh, I'm just in a mess here, don't worry about me. So here's my program running. All right, and so it's a moderately complicated MDI app that does a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah, anyway, I'm not going to talk about the program itself, but it's, you know, a toolkit for people who want to play around with 8 till 70 stuff. Probably none of you do, so it's fine. But it does include it, or will include at some stage, actual and IDE, a debugger itself for debugging something other than Pascal code. So let's put in a breakpoint here, and then see if we can reset, if we can move it. I don't remember. I haven't seen how you would do that. So I do get breakpoint properties, but I can't just pick it up and drag it. That's the first thing. Where he doesn't show the execution point. Yeah, I haven't seen if you can do this. It's possible you can do this on other platforms. The features that are exposed depend on the underlying capability of the debugger. So if you can reset it, I don't know how. Maybe you can do that here.
Thanks, Grahame.
Yeah, no, I don't think you can. Not on Windows anyway. Okay, so now, but while I'm here and looking at this piece of code, in the development, in the IDE view of the menu, you see I've got an Apple application menu here. When this application runs in a startup, if you're on OS X, not on OS X, you hide that. So when I run, that's not visible, right? You get standard. When it comes up, it's doing a bit of stuff at startup at the moment. I'm going to sort that out. Yeah, when it comes up, there's no Apple application menu. Right. When it comes up on on OS X, then I set the caption, this caption here, the Apple application, I set that to this particular sequence of Unicode characters. And then it will appear in the Apple menu in on my OS X system, right? So that's how you get a menu options into the OS X system menu while your application is running. If you haven't used OS X, you probably don't know what I'm talking about. If you have, you probably know what I'm talking about. So any questions about that? No, okay. What else did I want to say?
Grahame, I have a question that's not related to that particular feature, but I
Sure.
saw with interest that you said that you stick to the D-Unit and not D-Unit X because it's much easier to port to the unit testing tool that's available for FreePascal. Which one are you using, FPC Unit or the other one, the FP Test?
I use FPC Unit, but if I remember correctly, FP Test is built on top of FPC Unit.
Mm-hmm.
It's a framework for using FPC Unit. So we can jump into doing that.
The reason I'm asking is I was actually into it. I was trying to learn a lot of Lazarus, and I used the unit testing tool, and that was the one that turned me off, right? And I tried to ask a question in the main English-speaking Lazarus forum about a feature that I would have liked to see, right? But no one wanted it, and I wasn't good enough to implement it, right? If you are in D-Unit and you just select one test case, it's not just executing that test case, but any decorator that is in front of it, right? And I use decorators a lot to create an environment for a setup and a teardown that's only executed once. If you do the same with the FPC unit, it's only executing that test case. So all the stuff that my class was happily doing in D unit is not happening in an FPC unit because it just executes the test case. And there is no code that figures out where in the tree that item was ticked. And it doesn't tick the parent nodes as well as you tick your test case.
Well, maybe that's not a problem anymore.
Okay.
Just give me a couple of minutes to focus on other
good.
things, and then I'll come back and look at testing.
I had a question that's slightly related to where you are at the moment.
Yeah.
That's about stuff like other operating system dependencies, you know, stuff like file paths and file rename and delete, and the standard directories like app data and local app data and things like that. Sort of how much of it do you have to do if defs, and how much is sort of already wrapped in a platform independent way?
So those two things are on my to-do list. Just let me jump across and look at cross-platform stuff, and then I'll go look at code.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So you've been looking at Lazarus running Windows, no problems. Here is Lazarus running on Linux, Ubuntu. Really, it's not a very different experience. The code lives on a Unix rather than Windows, and so for your code, it can be a very different experience in terms of system paths, like John was just asking about, but using Lazarus and the whole debugging process, it's the same thing, right? It's the same code. In some ways, I prefer it on Linux as a user experience, but I'm still not entirely comfortable with some of the features of Linux from a programming perspective. I was just coming to terms with those. But you know, it's the same thing, and it works the same. And my code is mostly Linux capable. And now I am going to stop sharing for a second and share from here's Lazarus on my M1 Mac. It's a little bit different because you've got the Apple menu. But you still got the same code, you still got all Windows. The key bindings are really different because they are like Macintoshy key bindings, although you can reassign all those key bindings to function keys, unless you have this unhappy thing of having the stupid Mac taskbar, which doesn't really work for, you know, function keys. So I can't do that. So I've still got to bring myself to deal with the Mac keys. It's inefficient on the Mac at the moment just because of keystroke issues. But other than that, it's all the same. I do want to, at this point, just show you the Lazarus options, preferences, the same screen. You can choose your debugger, actual backend, and you'll see that I use Lazarus is set up to use LLDB on OS X. And so far, the big unhappy piece for me is I can't see variable values while debugging under OS X, and I haven't figured out what the cause of that is, and I have to spend some time chasing that down. Is it an M1 thing? Is it a version of LLDB? Should I choose a different LLDB? I haven't figured that out. But other than that, it's the same thing. It's a pig to install Lazarus on OS X, because the pig to install anything on OS X, it doesn't come through the App Store. But once you've installed it, sweet. And OS X is an even more foreign development environment than Linux, so you've got to deal with that. But you've got to deal with that whatever you do. And there's really nothing much more to say about Linux on OS X, other than it just works. once you have the install working. All right. Any more questions about OS X or Linux? No. Okay, we'll go back to Windows. Because it's nice and easy. Okay. All right, we can see Linux. We can see Lazarus again. Okay, all right. So I'm going to first of all show you.
Sorry, Graham. So things like file rename and delete and all of that just work cross-platform?
You have to chase down the appropriate FPC library, and sometimes that's kind of tedious, but there's almost always an FPC library to do stuff like that. That's cross-platform.
Yeah.
It's occasionally mystifying as to why it is where it is, but welcome to open source projects. The pros is almost always an answer. The con is you've got to find the answer.
Yeah.
All right. So let's first of all, the console. So every single process, every single file I write, except apparently the first one I looked in. How about that? Includes my include file for all my code. So if we're in FPC or else Delphi. So just so that nobody gets confused, my Delphi code only compiles Windows. I know Delphi will compile for other platforms, but I'm not interested and I'm not supporting it. And so at the moment it won't compile, right? But I compile Windows in 64, CPU 64 and 62 because those are standard compiles in the FPC space. And that means that I can just use standard if-defs in all my code and it'll behave the same between Lazarus and Delphi. FPC, the mode is always Delphi. So FPC can run in other more foreign Pascal modes, but I always use Delphi. Couple of features turned on for Delphi compatibility. Linux only compiles for 64-bit, Mac only compiles for 64-bit. I use Windows as my common define everywhere, and I always have. It's historical. And if it's not OS X or Darwin, or it's not Linux or OS X or Windows, it's not supported. I mean, if someone wants to change that, they're welcome to make a PR. But that's my standard FPC, Delphi compatibility includes it's everywhere. And then you'll see just that I'll use if-def Delphi or if-def FPC or if-def Linux or Darwin or Windows. That's what I use everywhere in my code. And occasionally I have CPU 32 or 64-bit specific code, but that's mostly old legacy graphic stuff that I haven't found native implementation stuff for and is broken in 64-bit almost always, because otherwise I just use like, you know, what is it, native int or native uint or whatever.
So we can find this file on your repo.
Yeah, it's in my repo. Yeah, it's just in it's in this my repo. It's just in the root in library. All right, and so what my typical code be? This is one of it's my base system unit in effect for me. So some hacking stuff for debugging, right? Windows, I use Windows message box. Otherwise, I'll use the FPC messaging. I mean, this is a typical question. FPC works with Windows and it works with on Windows, it works with these as well. So I could do this, right? That would be equal, but sure, a lot of those are, you know, arbitrary decisions. FPC doesn't have one of these argument strings defined, and the more recent version of Delphi does. So That's setting up a pretty comprehensive debugging. Here's something that you might find somewhere down in the system libraries is you'll have, particularly in the generics, things that Delphi can pull off with generics that FPC can't. And so I often have, you know, hackarounds for FPC or stuff commented out for Delphi. What else is interesting to comment on? It's a base. The other thing is that FPC doesn't support Lambda functions. What are they called in Delphi? I can't think right now. And I really like them, and I really miss them in FPC.
Anonymous methods.
Anonymous methods, yeah.
And I looked at that slightly when I did that conversion of my, I had a session a couple of months back. I looked at converting my sort routine, and that was a real issue for me.
Oh yeah, that's what I was looking for. So here is all of them defined, so I can use them in Delphi. And I often have, like for instance, my sort routine. I have 3 sort routines: one that takes an anonymous method, one that takes an event, and one that takes a class. And I can use this if I'm only using Delphi. I really like using it, and it's supposed to be a feature coming to FPC soon, but it hasn't. So, and then yeah, there's a few things you can pull off with generics in Delphi that you can't do it in FPC. It blows the compiler up. So there's a little bit of stuff, but all of these are like mucking around. Other than anonymous units, they're all mucking around with weird corner cases in generics, and you're unlikely to run into them. But yeah, that's most of what I have for ifdefs. And I try and push all my ifdefs down into my lowest level code. And so typically I don't have ifdefs in most of my code. I just say, open the file, work with it, save the file, move on, and push anything system specific down as far as I can go. And so I don't have that many ifdefs around the code. All right, last thing, test cases.
Grahame, just on the on the generics part, I've used the object dictionary recently a lot to keep key values in memory, right? Very fast to access. Are these regular classes that we know of Delphi available in the FreePascal about as well in the development version of FreePascal?
I don't know.
The object dictionary. So the dictionary classes, you know, to store something in
memory
to access it very fast. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got generics.defaults and generics.collections. They've what the rules are for FPC is they can use the same interface section, but they can't use any of the implementation section. So they work exactly the same way as the same thing in Delphi, but the implementations are written ground up from scratch. And in some ways they're faster, and in some ways they're slower because they're a re-implementation of the API. And then there's some weird stuff which is really disappointing, like in the comparer. The comparer has the parameters as constref instead of const, which means you can't write a comparer that's compile level compatible with between Delphi and FPC. Stupid decision on the part of FPC. And you can go to the FPC forums, which are really active and really useful and helpful, almost as good as ADUG, and find them arguing about. They've been arguing about that one for years because it's so annoying for people to write cross code between Delphi and FPC. All right, so testing code. No, I don't want those changes. Okay. Where do I Okay, so here's the full-blown server and the test code, and the test code uses find where my no, it's even further. Sorry about this. I just got to find this bit of code. It's the code I'm looking for. So this is the code that you're asking about when you ask whether I'm using DUnit or DUnit X. So I have my base test case, T common base, common test base case. So what I use is my base, and then it uses either FPC unit or test framework, the old DUnit, right? And then what I've wanted to do is push all of the platform differences between FPC unit and test framework down into this unit, so that from this unit I just inherit from these, and it just works with either. And so DUnit X uses decorations, which I can't use in FPC; they're not supported, and so it's just really hard work to make that work. And so in the end, I've got a common test base, and I inherit the stuff that I heat, and either a single test or a suite. And then, so let's go back to server. In the files, the server has there's a set of test cases for the server that. So I use testing start on Delphi with a DUnit test runner, and I wrote the testing framework for Lazarus, so that would work the same way to me as a user, and that's it down here. I won't spend more time on it. And then here's a typical, and then I have a test registry, which is where I was heading. So here's a typical set of tests for me. I'm going to test my generics functions, and you see they just inherit off test case, which goes back to no, okay, so I'm in a different set of packages, but yes, this is the unit I wanted. So again, it's the same. I'm either going to inherit off FPC unit or test framework. This is my full testing framework, where it's supposed to be before, sorry. So a test case, which has assertions, and then these, you see that these they've got different names. They work the same, but they have different names between Delphi and FPC unit. So I just pushed all the differences down here. A set of tests with test cases. They have, and then you register the tests the same way you do for FPC unit or DUnit. And it's not visible here, but they inherit by default setup and teardown, and the setup and teardown just works. I haven't had any issues with that. And then let's see, I tried this before, it wasn't working, so let's try. It's compiling in the background, compiling everything up. I don't know what it's doing. Why is it doing that? No, it didn't compile. Same problem. I've got some compile problem I didn't fix. All right, there's my test cases appearing. Because this is actually testing my test case library, I have a test cases that will fail or error. But if I just run this one and reset them, what do I do this? You can see how long it is. That's it. Yeah, I'll just run this test case. I mean, it will run all my setups and teardowns, but I don't use any fancy methods for doing them. I just code it so that I know that it's going to work on all my platforms. Okay, and that's where I wanted to finish. Sort of a quick rundown of my experience of using Lazarus. I haven't yet regretted deciding to invest in Lazarus over FireMonkey. And the biggest reason is because the forums are great. Whereas the forums with FireMonkey, it's really hard. But the Lazarus forum is really active and really helpful. So there you go. Questions?
Yeah. The class that I'm referring to in the unit is called t-test setup. And that actually operates then as a decorator. And what I just saw is that when you ticked one of your test cases, it also ticked all the nodes on the way up. And that seems to be a difference between what I've experienced about a year ago when I tried this. It would only execute the test case of that particular class, but not the ones that were responsible for creating the environment.
So
the ones
so
of setup and tear down.
This piece of work, I did this about 6 months ago for Lazarus.
Ah, okay. So right now, when you say uncheck all, right, and you check just the test pass, so yeah, actually that is exactly the problem, that those black boxes that are now ticked are not ticked in the regular one.
Well, I had lots of problems with the unit test runners for FPC unit, the default ones. I ended up writing my own console one and writing my own form visual one. And I wrote the visual one specifically so that it would fit into the IDE. So you can also run it here. I say you can run it directly. This would be more like a more classic approach.
Yeah. And is that part of your open source repository?
No, it's a separate repo.
Okay.
But that's the program running by itself, running as a separate program.
Yeah. Yeah. So see, when if you could just stay in there, right, in that one form.
Hang on, it's coming up again.
Yeah, not a problem.
Whoops. Yeah, there you go.
So, and we show that the one that is actually selected at the leaf level. Yeah. Okay. So the test pass may actually need a tear down or a setup of the t-test case test, and that needs a setup of the test case test 3, right? So it needs to go really up to the highest level, and whoever is involved, right, may have to create an environment for the test case, possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's how it works.
And that is actually what was not working for me, and that is why for my client-side testing, I have one data module that actually is in the main application too, and I create that as part of your t-test case or library test case, yeah? And the library test case in your case would then create the data module, and the data module keeps the connection open to the application server, so that I have got test cases for the application server, but also test cases for the client side. And it wouldn't actually create the DMO main, which has the connection to the DataSnap server. I mean, I'm not dealing with DataSnap in the end, but I just wanted to see if I can convert my test cases, and I couldn't. Yeah, and when I started asking questions about that, there was no real interest in what I'm asking for. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I found. There was not really very much interest in getting testing to work properly. It's all kind of weird.
Yeah, and that's when I turned away from Lazarus, which is a bummer.
Yeah. So anyway, I put the link to that repo in the chat for Zoom.
Oh, okay.
And feel free to play with it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the underlying Lazarus specific code in that repo.
Yeah.
The GUI runner, the console runner, the IDE runner, and a bunch of test cases for the test case framework. So feel free to have a look. As far as, I mean, I depend on the setup and teardown working properly.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, so it should work. All
Thank
right,
you so
any
much.
other questions?
Debugging, looking at objects. Is there good ways of doing that?
Yeah, so let's see. Let's go back to it is not as good, but it's got a lot better. So in console, we'll get a form create, and we've got a object that we can play and look at here in background tasks. Oh, I hit the wrong button. Somehow I made it recompile everything. I don't know what I did to do that.
Must have known it was a demo and you didn't want it to.
Yeah, of course, demo. Here we go. Here we go. Okay, so you just get this text dump of the classes of the objects, of the properties of the object. It's not anywhere near as good as Delphi. That part is true. Although in practice, I haven't found it that much of a challenge. I don't know whether it's just the way that I work, or like initially I was like, well, this is a disaster. This is not going to be at all, you know, functionally equivalent. But I've really looked at it and gone, I really want more than this. I have at times, but you know, I've got evaluate, modify, or inspect. So I've got the debug inspector here to inspect background task. It's not as clever, but it's there and it's usable. So it's kind of, it's certainly not as good as Delphi, but yeah, I found it less of a factor than I expected when I first ran into it.
Okay.
Well, I have used that stuff in the past was that I was about to execute a query and I asked the FD query component at .sql for save to file to have a text representation of the query. And that was helpful because then I could actually see what, or could try to run the query and see what the administration tool of the database said to me. Would that be possible? Would I be able, if I use the 0DB components or whatever they are called, to do something like that before, meanwhile I debug and before I actually execute the query?
I'm not sure. I don't use that component, and I'm not sure what the subtle ins and outs are.
Yeah,
But there are times in Delphi when you look at a property to make something happen in the code. I've done that too. You can't do that. You can't do that in the same way in Lazarus. I mean, you probably could pull it off, but it's much trickier to pull off. And more often I say, oh, I wanted to see that. I'll change it, recompile, rerun, and do it. So you do have to do that a bit more often.
Yeah.
But like I said, it turned out to be less of a problem for me, at least, than I thought it would be.
Okay.
So,
Paul McGee, is your question answered?
Oh yeah, I was just not seeing the text on the screen properly. Thank you.
Okay.
I do have a question about how much access do you have to sort of GDB in Lazarus, or is that kind of behind the scenes?
it's behind the scenes. You do get this.
Because I've seen some videos of GDB running on Linux that can do some pretty specky things like running your code backwards and different things.
I have no information about that. You do get on Linux. I mean, I haven't. Oh, here we go. I don't know. We could we could try this on Linux. Here we go. Let's it doesn't look like anything obvious has surfaced. What have we got in debugging windows?
What about
You do have another
debug?
feature in Linux, which you don't have on other platforms, which is that you can write directly to the console in the IDE. But that's a Linux feature, not a Lazarus feature. You can't do that on other platforms. But I don't see anything really clever here. So either I don't know the answer or there is no answer. I'm not sure.
What happens when there was a debug when you right-clicked on the line? Sorry. If you get, if you right-click and go down, there's a debug with an opening window. Oh, okay.
Yeah, nothing really clever. So I don't know. You might, there's quite a lot of work going on the debugger, so it could be, there could be things that you want to define. There's a whole pile of options down here in the debugger. I don't know whether any of these would turn on some clever behavior, or I don't know what all these are. I haven't looked into them. So, but they're all GDB stuff, or you can use, I don't know if the debug, there's the internal debugger they're working up, which does have less external dependencies. But I don't know. Sorry.
Oh.
I had two questions. One of them, have they implemented attributes?
Attributes. I don't think so.
Okay, thanks.
Might be Unix users.
Yeah.
No, they haven't implemented those. At least as not as I know. I mean, if I ever decided I really wanted them, I'd go and ask on the Lazarus forum. But I haven't felt the need.
And the other question was, some time back, a couple of years back, you were having problems with Delphi streams. Do streams work better in Lazarus than they work in Delphi? Mainly performance issues.
I don't remember that in particular, and I haven't noticed anything. It just works, but I haven't really hammered streaming. I can tell you that a default in general, nothing to do with streaming, in general, a Delphi compile is quicker than a Lazarus compile. And an optimized Delphi compile is way quicker than an unoptimized Lazarus compile. But a really fully optimized Lazarus compile is very quick indeed, because you're actually using the backend, stuff from the open source tooling stack. And they've got a lot of work in it over the many, decades now. But that's nothing about streams. The only thing with streams that jumps out at me is I was really annoyed by changing the streaming API interface between Delphi versions at one stage. And it's really hard to write code that's independent of Delphi versions when you're writing your own. Is it iStream? So not iStream, I think. And of course, I never had that problem in Lazarus because I don't care about iStream. But I don't think that's what you're asking about.
No, it's not. the issue I was asking about related to sort of basically text streams, and the issue was that when you were using like UTF-8, it was looking at it and it was out of the buffer was out of line, so it deleted the first character and tried again, and then the buffer was out of line, and there was stuff about,
I don't
you know,
think that's any. I don't think that's better. I think I've come to terms with that. It's just the way Unicode works.
yeah, it was just a really dumb implementation in the RTL, and it really slowed things down. And I thought you might have even re-implemented it. I can't remember.
Yeah, but in the end, I didn't. I think there's some subtle corner case, which means you can't write a good implementation or something. Well, I'm a bit hazy about this.
Okay.
But I haven't ended up with something really way better.
So you're using text streams in your code, and they haven't been a big issue.
No, it's fine, and I use them a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
Fine.
Any other questions?
Hi, Graham. Martin Gale here. Can you hear me?
Hey. Yep.
Yeah. Just thanks for the presentation. It's clear from the amount of work you put into this that you're really backing Lazarus now, and that's going to be a major thing, maybe because it's open source, I guess, and your main project's open source. Yeah, essentially, it's great that you've got confidence in that. And do you know much about the background of the main developers in Lazarus and how keen they are to keep on going? And one would hate to jump, to from Delphi to Lazarus and then find that Lazarus fizzles out as well. So what do you have any sort of background on what that key team are doing and how keen they are, and are they getting stronger with Delphi reducing, or is it going to be a problem that Lazarus may also falter at some point?
The course for an open source project is radically different from a commercial project. It fails differently. In the years that I've been playing around with Lazarus, it's gone from something that didn't work to something that worked, to something that worked well, to something that worked impressively. And the size of the number of the community using it has grown accordingly. It's gotten bigger and bigger, and the forums have got busier and busier. And the derivative commercial work of it has grown and become available.
Right.
For me, those are all healthy signs of a good open source ecosystem. But yes, it does depend on a few maintainers who have a lot of knowledge and context and contacts. I haven't researched them to find out where they're situated. On the other hand, a commercial project like Delphi, it's a different set of pros and cons. But if I think, so I want to say two things about that. I think it's far more likely that Delphi will collapse than Lazarus will collapse. But it's far more likely that Delphi would be continued to be maintained healthy commercial for the degree to which it is healthy, than that Lazarus will continue at the same level of health. So different kinds of risks there. If I was writing Windows-only applications, then I would totally stick with Delphi right now. I wouldn't go to Lazarus unless I had cross-platform interest. Now, one of the big risks for me, obviously, in the investment in Lazarus is that Embarcadero will turn around and start producing, cross-platform IDEs. Because I don't believe in their strategy right now, and it's a shame, because I thought Delphi is a great product. But it's clear that they've never managed to produce, and they won't, for me, I won't believe in the Embarcadero strategy until Delphi is a native OS X or Linux application. I'm sorry, but that's where I am now. But if I was Windows only, I would not touch Lazarus. I'd totally stick with Delphi. It's still the best commercial compiler. Not the best compiler, it's still the best way to develop Windows applications. But if you're stuck and you have to support OS X, then yeah, well, Lazarus, and you want to port code or share code, Lazarus is your best option, and that's commercially the best option. That's my thing.
Some of the business policies of IDERA are questionable. And whilst I have every confidence in the team at Embarcadero, I could imagine that they treat it as a cash cow. And so the question is not so much what is the future of Lazarus, but how much is the company willing to spend on Delphi? Yeah, and that is also a risk from my point of view. How much resources they take out of that to maximize the revenue for the company.
Sure. It's every year I pay the subscription. I'm just sort of wondering whether I should be taking everything across to Lazarus, but it's so much work. And then if that went flat, that would be a waste of a lot of time as well. So that's the dilemma.
Yeah. I have found that partly it's the way I wrote my code, but initially it was really, really slow going to convert the code because I was but everything is in the low level units. And then once I had the low level units converted, it actually got pretty quick.
Sure.
Because I mean, it compiles the code except for attributes and anonymous methods. And yeah, so I mean, you as you say, you've got to choose your risks.
And just off topic slightly, how's FHIR going? Is that getting more adopted? And
yeah, plastic. We're very much, a health exchange method of choice. Particularly since COVID arrives, it's been intense. Projects all over the world, official policy in lots of countries. Yeah, it's going better than I could dream of. Of course, the problem with that phase of your engagement is that now you're engaged with governments and large companies who know how to run projects, but they also know how to blame someone else when they screw them up.
Yeah. So getting very political. Yeah. So, okay, well that's good. Yeah, just you may know or remember that I'm a dentist there, and it really hasn't hit dentistry at all. Yes, and the software vendors in dentistry are really quite resistant to.
Yeah. I mean, it's a business problem. What makes you want to exchange data? I was talking to my dentist about it, and he was kind of like, "I've got my own little closed box.
Yeah.
I'm happy." Yeah, and then you're looking at it going, but actually, if you look back at the long term, and this is the same in most business lines, right? If you look back at the long term, big picture, you're like, having your own little box just doesn't go anywhere, right?
Yeah.
But that's where everybody is in healthcare right now, and so that's where we're going to stay for a while yet. And in fact, I was kind of hopeful when COVID came that everybody would get on board with going, really, we didn't want to be where we were when it arrives. We actually want to do genuine digital transformation, but in practice, what's happened is everybody did what they had to do and said, "Oh, we're not doing any more." And we go back to the same, infrastructurally broken arrangements and calling that done. Welcome to healthcare in the world in 2020.
Well, the separate software vendors don't want to communicate with other software vendors because that would mean that their customers may leave their products and go to another product. So that's the risk, I think. From a small software vendor, if you take a large company, clearly like Google or whatever, they're obviously very keen to become dominant across all spheres. So they're keen to obviously get into FHIR or whatever. But small vendors want to have a moat around their product. They don't want to have anybody else able to get their data. So,
Grahame,
yeah, so,
sorry?
yeah, sure.
Grahame, you mentioned that you had to go through some hoops to get the latest version of OpenSSL working with the Indy components. I met a guy at a conference in Europe before the pandemic, and he said, when I told him that we are using OpenSSL, well, you couldn't apply for any government job in the UK if you're using OpenSSL because they regard this as foolish, right? Government agencies in the UK. Now, what were the types of changes that you had to do in order to get the latest, the support for the latest? And have you ever encountered, now that you're dealing with the bigger fish, right? Agencies, government agencies out there that said, no, I'm not with OpenSSL, I'm sorry.
Look, I encounter a variety of opinions about OpenSSL itself. I mean, but it's more about how you feel about open source rather than anything else. There certainly was real problems with the OpenSSL API, the OpenSSL approach, and then there was a couple of really big bugs found in OpenSSL that were like screamers. And so they went back and redesigned the API and did a lot of work on code testing, code verification, and some big companies threw real resources at making OpenSSL secure and reliable. And so my kind of experience of government views is that they certainly did have a real issue with OpenSSL back before all that happened. And some of them still do, but I think that they're wankers. Honestly, if you want some really solid code, OpenSSL is really solid now, particularly now they've redone the API, because a lot of their issues came around how the API worked. For me, that means that I have to use the most recent version of OpenSSL. The currently released Indy version of Indy doesn't use the current OpenSSL.
Yeah, that's
but there's a branch which I've been contributing to and working with and on, which is the new OpenSSL wrapper for Indy. It's up on GitHub, on the Indy GitHub, and that branch is solid and reliable and well proven. And I've certainly, it's passing all my test cases, and I've thrown, had quite a lot of stuff thrown at it in terms of a wrapper. I mean, the real question for me is, if you're on the current version of OpenSSL, not an old version, if you're on the current version of OpenSSL and someone says to you, well, OpenSSL is crap and unreliable, what other choice do you have to offer that's as thoroughly inspected and hammered as OpenSSL? Right? There's nothing. Yeah, you can get a commercial implementation, but it's not going to be more secure just because it's commercial.
Well,
right?
Is that why the UK? Sorry, I was just wondering if that's why the UK government doesn't like OpenSSL, that they can get backdoors into some of the other implementations.
Look, it's possible. But the UK government in particular is a very insular security culture. And partly because of the things you just talked about, and partly because they depend very much on commercial secret arrangements with commercial companies. OpenSSL is really secure in the open, but it requires you to have a very different mindset about how things are tested and what. That's my perspective.
What needs to be done to make the current version, the one that's on GitHub, the default one for Delphi to be deployed with? Because currently, when I look at my stuff, I can't actually load any of the newer DLLs, right? Because it still depends on the old API that was there before. I think my DLL is about 2.5 years old, something like that I can use at max.
Well, what I'll do is there's a PR. Yeah, this one. Here's the link to the branch that's got the current code, which is the code for the future. And I'll read you the last comment from Remy Laval about this. Remy says, when someone asked him, when can we have this? Remi's the decision maker, right? It's up to Remi to decide that he's happy with it and he hasn't got around to it. And Embarcadero, really, we need Embarcadero to lean on Remi. That's the only path that will drive Remi to get around to it. He's had it for it's been 104 coverings on the PR and increasingly there. When will this be done? And it was made 8 months ago. So if you guys have any angle on Embarcadero should lean on Remi because it's ridiculous. On the other hand, you can just say, to hell with it, I'll just use that branch.
You spoke about you'd stick with Lazarus for cross-platform stuff, but if you were starting all of this completely from scratch, are there any non-Pascal cross-platform alternatives that you'd go with, or would you stick with Lazarus?
I have a huge amount of legacy code, so I didn't really think this through. But your general choices are a poison chalice. There's Lazarus, there's Electron, there's Flutter, there's Go, there's just general JavaScript and HTML and REST, which is kind of actually Electron as a app development framework anyway. Or there's Visual Studio or Eclipse or Java. Horrible. I mean, Java, I do a lot of Java code, but I wouldn't write an app in Java ever. I don't think that the Microsoft platforms, I just can't really commit to them as a true cross-platform thing. Apple wants you to use Swift, and it's really nice, but it's not really a cross-platform strategy. If I was really going to write a cross-platform app from scratch today, I would hold my nose and use Electron and probably React, but I hadn't really known about the JavaScript side of things that well. Just as an app delivery framework, in the end, for me, I will be stuck to using open source, and the very first and last question I'm going to ask is, how big is the community using this stuff? And that's why Electron.
Got this one here from TMS, Holger Flick, TMS Web Core. And it's a transpiler. It compiles but it transposes your Pascal code into JavaScript and allows you to run the application in Electron.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you've got a backend to it to write as well, or you don't have to have a backend with Electron. And then you can ship into Electron, but Electron is really just a way to deliver an HTML app, a web app, as a deliverable app, and so I would settle there, unless, because if you're writing open source, at least you're going to get more contributors who know that stuff, even if you think there's a better way. Not because it's better, but that's just how it is.
Yeah. REM objects have got some options, but they appear to be very dependent on one person.
I mean, for me, those are options that sit within a way to deploy server-side components that are support for an app, but I wouldn't have thought of those as a way to write a desktop app.
Yeah, REM objects now can target all sorts of platforms. The last I haven't looked at them for a while, but they look pretty interesting the last time I looked at them.
I might leave now, but thanks, Grahame. That was really interesting.
Yeah,
I learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Grahame. I found it fascinating. I've learned a lot.
Me too.
Yeah.